for inviting me, Martin. Delighted to come and speak to you all today. Just to give you a bit of background on what I'm going to talk about, I suppose just say I'm in the School of Applied Social Studies and also involved with ISS 21, which is UCC's Social Science Institute. But even though I'm in the Department of Applied Social Studies, my academic background is in geography and urban and cultural geography, which is where this kind of interest in disability from perhaps a more spatial understanding has come from. And also I worked for a few years before I came to Ireland for the Disability Rights Commission, which is very much working around anti-discrimination legislation and measures. So I suppose I've been involved in a more kind of policy world as well before coming back into academia after my PhD. So what I want to talk to you today about is a specific research project that we're doing. I know when Martin contacted me and said, can you come and speak about something around space and disability and cities and justice, but I thought, the current thing I'm working on at the moment is this 2-year Irish Research Council funded project, and I thought it might be useful in terms of just exploring the different elements of the project and how we're starting to try and theorise that a bit. So this is the first day, I think, the first time that we've started to present some of the actual findings from the project. It started in January 2017. It's a 2-year project, so we're still in the process of undertaking fieldwork, so we're by no means finished, so you'll have to bear with me if some of this is a little preliminary, but we're trying to figure out and theorise some of the findings that we're coming up with. So, just to give you a bit of introduction or context to this then. A few years ago, in 2012, I was involved in conducting a piece of research for the National Disability Authority in Ireland, which explored the experience of people with disabilities when they're victims of crime and their encounters with the criminal justice system. Now, it's pretty much a kind of secondary piece of research in the sense it was very much kind of lit review, but we did some interviews with people involved in the criminal justice system, with the DPP, with people in the HSE, with people with guards. Well, trying to get access to the guards, that's one of the to speak to the guards. I know I rang Amanda about that. Not always the easiest to get access to get guards to speak to. But anyway, this is a piece of research. I should also mention that I worked in conjunction with Shane Kilcummins, who's actually in law, heads up the School of Law here, and Jill Harold, who worked with me on this. So that study was very interesting in terms of just highlighting some of the real barriers that people with disabilities experience when, if they are a victim of crime and they come into contact with the criminal justice system. So everything from being or not being taken seriously as a witness, for example, particularly in the context of people with intellectual disabilities, through to, if people do have to go to court, the kind of inaccessibility of courtrooms, but also that process in, if you do have to be in a courtroom and that everything is giving about, I suppose, presenting yourself in a way that very much premises speech, about being able to make a coherent argument, and for people with ID or have other communication issues or might be deaf and require an interpreter, it's very ill-equipped to kind of meet their needs. And I suppose just in the context of that piece of research, it, I suppose, opened our eyes to all sorts of other issues in terms of access to the justice system, but also issues that in context in which people with disabilities do find themselves or might find themselves as victims of crime. And I suppose you might be aware that, I suppose more internationally, there's been a broader recognition of the fact that people with disabilities are more likely to experience violence and hostility than their able-bodied counterparts. So there's a big World Health Organization study a few years ago which highlighted that, and this also includes children with disabilities as well, more likely to be subject to abuse and violence. Then there's also, I suppose, international debates about the notion of hate crime, and obviously we have one of the kind of experts here in the room on that in terms of Amanda's work, being fantastic, Amanda and Jennifer, in terms of pushing forward that work in Ireland around hate and hostility. So internationally there's those kind of debates going on in terms of thinking about people with disabilities. And I suppose from my perspective, just in combination with that study and given my kind of geographical background, I was just more interested in how geographical perspectives can bring some understanding to the kind of dynamics of hate or hostility or even just fear of those dynamics in disabled people's lives. So, there's been a little bit of work done around that in geography, but not specifically around disability, so I'll explain more about that. Okay, and I suppose just even thinking about these things, often we see these kind of cases in the media, kind of high, more high-profile cases, perhaps some of the more serious cases where people with disabilities have been victims of crime. But I mean, these were just a couple of examples over the last few years that were reported on. So people might remember the case in Dublin in 2013 where there was a woman with intellectual disabilities who was kind of removed from a public space and was sexually assaulted. In County Kerry then in 2011, there was an incident where someone who was, it was more kind of rural area, but someone who was known to the woman kind of invaded her kind of the private space of the home and assaulted her there. And I suppose these cases just raise questions about, what does that mean in terms of our understandings of safety, in terms of public spaces and private spaces, and how we understand those spaces, but also the impacts that these type of events have on people with disabilities' lives and how it affects the type of spaces they might be able to, that they feel comfortable in, how they encounter different spaces. So, a lot of the reporting, around these cases, like the case in Dublin, explained how, the woman, as a result of what happened, is kind of very fearful of strangers, that, the sense that her education, independence, and all the work that had been done to kind of support her to live in the community, to support her to live independently, had just been blown away by this particular event. So, just raised questions for me about how we think about those dynamics in terms of how people use spaces and perhaps how people's daily habits and rituals and mobilities kind of feed into those understandings. Do stop me, by the way, anytime if you have any questions. I know we can have questions at the end, but if there's anything that isn't clear. So just to explain a bit about the current study that we're working on, and I suppose I'm leading it, but we've Nicola Maxwell, she's a colleague of mine at UCC, she's the kind of project officer, researcher working on the project with me. So I suppose it's called Disability in the Creation of Safer Space, and I suppose it's really a study, a 2-year study exploring how the experience and or fear of hostility and hate or violent crime affects the everyday geographies and mobilities of people with disabilities. So how does that, how do people construct as well this kind of sense of safety or unsafety in different types of places? And I suppose we're very much trying to look at that from the perspective of people with disabilities themselves, but also professionals, policymakers, how they think about these issues. And I suppose it's particularly timely in terms of some of the developments that are going on in legislatively and in disability policy at the moment. So obviously we've just had the kind of recognition of the UN CRPD, which recognised the kind of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which recognised the like I said, the kind of rights of people with disabilities, but also the also the thing about people moving from congregated settings out into the community. So that's another kind of key dynamic that's going on. I should just have a break a minute. I'm just feeling a bit kind of. Okay, sorry, I'm just feeling kind of weird then. So just in terms of the study, I suppose we're looking at these ideas around geographies of unsafety and what safety means to people with disabilities. And it's really around thinking about the everyday negotiation about safety and unsafety for people with disabilities. And in that context, I suppose we're not just looking at kind of fear of violent crime or not just looking at the experience of violence or hostility, but it's also about people's understandings of fear. So in that way, it's very much a kind of continuum. So we're kind of recognising that safety, it's not just these things, these kind of categories in terms of safety or unsafety, are not just fixed or binary categories. It's very much a continuum. So someone can feel, very much kind of fearful. They can feel very fearful in terms of their experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've kind of experienced a violent crime. And often we have these kind of categories created by kind of policy and legal actors and institutions. So, the legal system will talk about victims of crime, or we talk about hate crime. But what we're trying to argue is that safety is a broader categorisation. And I suppose it allows you to very much explore kind of different understandings of, safety and how we think about that. Okay. I suppose the project has what we call like a 3-stage methodology. So In the first phase, we've been doing interviews with policymakers and national disability organisations. So this happened in the kind of first 6 months of the project that we were kind of looking at. And I mean, that was just interesting in terms of getting the perceptions of policymakers who, you know, many of whom hadn't really necessarily thought about these issues for people with disabilities, and national disability organisations. And again, our sense of talking to national disability organisations was that they hadn't particularly thought about safety, particularly in the context of people moving from congregated settings into the community. So, you know, even though there is this kind of trend to kind of move people into the community, they haven't really necessarily thought about what might be the issues of, for example, someone moving into a form of housing in an isolated housing estate, or thinking about, you know, spaces where it might be appropriate to kind of house people. So that's, I suppose, the first phase. That's the kind of first 6 months in terms of, you know, what we've been doing. So those interviews are completed now. Phase 2, which is, I suppose, the main bulk of the study, is fieldwork that we're conducting in 3 different case study areas. So we've picked one urban area, one rural area, and one kind of small town. So we're kind of halfway through those case studies at the moment, and the idea of those case studies is to speak to both people with disabilities, with a range of disabilities, so that includes people with intellectual disabilities, people with mobility impairments, people with sensory impairments, so visual impairments, and people with hearing impairments. And then also people with ID as well. So we're looking, you know, trying to get a cross-section of that, of those people, and then also looking at professionals working in those areas. So in each case study area, we're hoping to speak to around 10 people with disabilities and then 10 professionals. And when I'm talking about professionals or practitioners, I'm talking about the Gardaí, perhaps HSE, disability organisations, some of these agencies. And in terms of that fieldwork as well, what we're trying to do, particularly in the phase, the part with people with disabilities, is we're conducting interviews with them, but we're also trying to use a few other methods to help us explore people's experiences of being out in different spaces. So one of the things we're doing, and we're having to be very, I suppose, sensitive around this in terms of some methods might work for some people, but they might not work for others. So one thing we're doing is we're doing kind of walkabouts with people in terms of going around their local areas where we get them to kind of talk to us as we walk, in terms of how they feel in different spaces or other particular spaces they might avoid. We're also getting people to take photographs, you know, where they feel they want to do that, you know, as a way of kind of forming a discussion about, you know, what sort of areas do you know, find safe? Why do you find these areas, you know, safe or unsafe? So I see that as very much testing out those methodologies. I wouldn't say, you know, we're using in the case of every participant, but it's a way to, I think, get a kind of more embodied sense of people's experiences in those spaces, rather than just an interview where you sit in a room and you kind of talk to people about, you know, how they feel about it. So yeah, so we've still, I suppose we've still at least another 6 months of the project to run, and we've still got quite a bit more field work to do in terms of the case studies, but I suppose we're getting there in terms of the you know, the study. So we're at a stage where we're kind of beginning the analysis now, and you know, it's some really I think interesting stuff coming out of it. Okay. So I suppose before I go on, I'm going to talk to you today, I suppose, in terms of share some of the initial findings from the work with people with disabilities. So that's going to be the kind of main focus in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about. But I suppose what is kind of set out in my abstract was that we're trying to look at ways that we might theorise this type of our findings, really. And I suppose one of the ways in which we can do that is looking to geographical literature. And recently there's been a lot of work done on this idea of relational geographies, which isn't something that's limited to geography, actually. It's something that you've probably seen in sociology as well. So we're kind of looking at the idea, trying to explore some of these ideas. I suppose before I go on to this relational bit, I think it's important to talk about how and why does space matter, really. And I know some of you may be familiar with geography or not. I'm not sure if people have any kind of geographical background. But in terms of thinking about space, I suppose geographers will very much see space as something that's socially constitutive. Okay, so it's not just an entity that things happen upon, or it's not just a container that things happen in. It's actually something that's socially constituted. So by the way that we use space, by the way that, you know, we form our identities by being in space, by the way that social relations come together to create a particular type of spaces, some of which might be exclusive or inclusive. So it's very much seeing space as a product of social relations, which then, you know, go on to shape spaces in different types of ways. So, you know, we would argue that, you know, people's identities are bound up in different types of spaces and places, and they're also constitutive of power relations. So, I mean, on a basic level, if we look at particular ways in which buildings are designed, for example, in terms of people with disabilities, we can see that, you know, clearly, you know, often people with disabilities haven't been thought about, or they're a reflection of kind of ableist values which don't really take into account disabled people's bodily differences. So I suppose in relation to this study, there's a couple of particular bodies of literature which are very helpful initially in starting to theorise the topic. So one of these is Geographies of Fear of Violent Crime, and this is a body of literature that, I don't know if people have come across the work of Rachel Payne, she's a geographer in Durham University, and also Jill Valentine. And I suppose their work is very much coming from a feminist understanding, and they're very concerned with how gender power relations shape how bodies are valued or devalued or stigmatised in different types of places. So, you know, often we have this sense that, you know, women shouldn't be out late in public spaces at night time. You know, there's this perception that women are, I suppose, are, you know, naturally fearful or vulnerable and therefore out of place in particular spaces. And, you know, they talk about the ways in which, I suppose, spatial perceptions shape our everyday practices. And I suppose one of the things they've done also is this idea of challenging home as a safe space. So Rachel Payne's recent work has looked at domestic violence, and she's very much looked at, you know, how often these perceptions that home is a safe space for women don't hold up, basically. Yeah. I just suppose the other body of literature that's very helpful here then is around geographies of disability. And this is a kind of body of work which you know, has very much focused on how geographers can understand how particular spaces exclude people with disabilities. And I suppose the initial area of this work very much focused on would tie in very much with the kind of social model of disability, which recognised that there's particular barriers or environmental barriers which exclude people. But more recently, this work has kind of looked more at, you know, the embodied nature of disability and looking at how, you know, people's bodies and minds interact with environments, you know, and how, I suppose, the process of impairment gives a particular meaning to different environments and mobilities. So there's been a real focus on the kind of materialities of living with the impaired body, and also trying to challenge some of these binary categorisations of kind of impairment and disability as well, or disabled and able-bodied. And you may be aware, in terms of understanding disability, that there's often been this divide between what we would call medical and social models of disability. So the medical model very much sees disability in terms of biology. It's something, you know, impairment is kind of what is wrong with you, in a kind of biological sense. But the social model of disability very much sees disability as a product of social oppression, of particular barriers in the environment, whether that be in the kind of economic environment, in terms of access barriers, in terms of people's attitudes towards disability. And I suppose one of the more recent work in geographies of disability has tried to look at ways in which we can, I suppose, overcome this binary between the kind of medical and social. And this isn't limited to geography either. There's a whole area of work called critical disability studies, where people have tried to use perhaps more kind of post-structuralist ideas to try and explore, you know, how can we think about the body, the relationship between the body and the environment in a more complex and nuanced way. So we recognise, you know, it's not just either kind of environmental barriers or what's wrong with the body. It's about trying to look at the multiplicity of processes that happen, that create the experience of disability. And this can vary in different types of places and spaces. So it's trying to, like I say, overcome some of these binaries, or this sense that there's a particular disabled identity. So often we have this sense in society that disability is about, you know, vulnerability. But how do we kind of challenge some of these ideas? So I suppose together, what we're trying to do in this project is use some of the literature coming from the Geographies of Fear of Violent Crime literature, which, as I say, has been really helpful in thinking about how we understand fear of violent crime and spaces in relation to that. But as I say, that work hasn't really touched on disability, so as I say, there's been a lot of stuff which has been very much gender focused, but not in terms of disabled people's experiences. Likewise, with the kind of geographies of disability, the approach to disability which recognises that, that interaction between the body and environment has been very helpful, but it hasn't specifically looked at fear of violent crime or safety or those issues. So we're trying to bring some of that literature together. But I suppose, like, moving some of these debates on again, in recent years there's been this move in geography to explore these ideas of what we call kind of relational geographies. And one of the kind of key approaches in this is around what we call non-representational theory. And this is something that's kind of come out of geography, a particular geographer called Nigel Thrift. And I suppose what he was trying to highlight was the way in which, really to develop a kind of practice of geography. So what he was saying, there's been too much emphasis, he felt, in the discipline on issues of representation, how things are represented. And what we need to look at is our actual bodily practices. That's how day-to-day life happens. We need to look at our interactions with the environment. And these kind of ideas have been fused and kind of coming into geographies of disability now in terms of thinking about what are our kind of everyday bodily experiences of actually being in the world. Okay, so it's not really about how bodies are represented, it's about what is that experience. And people have done really interesting work, even doing like video recordings of people out walking, how they literally feel about being in different spaces and how we kind of, pick up those sensory perceptions of space, So it's very much about the idea of the body as a process of becoming as well, that it's not just about we have these kind of fixed bodies. So it's very much focusing on, our embodied experience, our affectual, emotional experiences of being in space and being in the world. And this idea that bodies aren't fixed either, but are in a state of becoming, so that performances, the body is involved in performances that occur in conjunction with particular objects or contexts. Okay? So a lot of this work as well is informed by the ideas of post-structuralist theories such as Deleuze and Guattari, you can see some of the examples here in terms of the paper by Stevens et al., which really interesting article looking at how children's embodiment is understood in different ways in different spaces. So even this idea that for children with disabilities, like the notion of falling, has a particular social meaning in a school context as opposed to being at home. So children, they recognise that children with disabilities often felt they didn't mind if they kind of fell at home or if they crawled at home, as that was their preferred way of moving around. But in school there was a particular stigma around that, and they have to negotiate that in that different type of space. Yeah. So it's really just about trying to, I think, try to provide a kind of more complex understanding or kind of more nuanced understanding of the multiplicity of processes. And I suppose a key element of this is around this idea of assemblage thinking, which is very much a kind of Deleuzian concept. That we have to think about our subjectivities, or about being in space as constructed not just through our body, but how our body comes into interaction with other bodies, so with other people or other bodies, both human and non-human, but also between objects, environments, and social meanings that are given to these objects and environments. That might sound a bit strange in terms of we're kind of looking at these kind of all these different elements, but it's really about recognising that things aren't static and that we constantly recreate our kind of subjectivities in relation to all these different elements. And I suppose the reason that this seems, or potentially might be helpful in the context of this study, is that it has the potential to destabilise this idea of the disabled subject, that disabled people are vulnerable, they have a vulnerable identity, or they behave in this particular way, or they shouldn't be in particular spaces. That we often we have these ideas about this space is inclusive, this versus another space which might be exclusive to people with disabilities. But what we have to look at through a relational approach, we'll kind of say, well, we have to think about what is that embodied subjectivity, when people are in that space, how do they negotiate that? And that might be quite different in different types of spaces. I think the other thing that's helpful is this focus on kind of embodiment and emotion. so often, even if we look at kind of disability literature that talks about access, this idea that, if we provide access to people with disabilities, it's kind of a technical fix. We'll fix something in the built environment. But actually, what does the environment, or what do these kind of fixes mean for people with disabilities, both kind of emotionally and in an embodied sense, And I suppose I'll go on and explain how I think, we can look at that in the context of people's safety. I think the other thing as well that it potentially has could provide for us to capture the complexity and ambiguity that surrounds hostility, fear of violent crime, and safety, because these are things that can be kind of malleable categories in terms of how people feel about being in particular spaces. So these are kind of questions. I'm not saying it's definitely this approach, and there's critiques of this theory, these kind of ideas as well, which we can talk about at the end. But people have been starting to use within kind of geographies. There's been a couple of projects which have looked at notions of fear of crime and in nighttime spaces, and also fear of crime, also safety, that use these kind of ideas of assemblage. So Jelle Brands and Tim Schwannen conducted a study in cities in the Netherlands where they kind of looked at people's understandings of fear of crime. And they talk about, using a relational approach in this context. So they talk about, they kind of say that our objective is to analyse fear of crime as an event that emerges from the ongoing assembling of associations among human and non-human, material and discursive elements, and to examine how nightlife visitors reflect on the roles of lighting, policing, and undesired others within emergent assemblages. Okay, so I suppose I want to turn now to some of the findings from the study. To just talk you through how I suppose some of these elements in terms of thinking about safety or unsafety as an assemblage or disability might be helpful. So just before I kind of go on to this, just to give you a few starting points. So the material I'm going to refer to here is based on field work with 12 participants with disabilities. We're hoping the final study will have 30 participants in terms of people with disabilities. I suppose just to say as well that inviting people to participate, we weren't saying that you had to have been a victim of crime or that you had to have experienced violence or hostility. It was broader than that because we're trying to get to an understanding of people's senses of safety or not. But having said that, some people have been victims of crime or have had incidents in which they were kind of abused or assaulted. Or just to say, at this stage, the mix of people with different impairments. Just because the way the recruiting is going, we've got more people with visual impairments at the moment, so quite a lot of large subsection of these respondents will be people with visual impairments of some kind. We've got 3 people with mobility impairments, 2 with intellectual disabilities, and at the moment they're respondents from kind of 2 different case study areas. All of them are living in the community, so we don't have anyone who's living in an institutional setting, or there are a couple of people who've moved out from institutional settings into the community. And just say as well, I suppose this is analysis in progress in terms of how we're going about it. So, I think one of the interesting things, if we start off by looking at how people even just conceptualise or frame the notion of safety or unsafety, it's quite instructive. And for me, this is where, when people started talking about safety, this is where I started thinking or looking at these ideas of assemblage, because it seemed to encompass so many different things in terms of their lives, and also invoked quite I suppose an embodied, or there was a very much an embodied effectual aspect to this. So just to, I suppose, look at some of the some of the responses when we ask people what does kind of safety or unsafety mean to you. So Martina, who has a mobility and a chronic health condition, she was someone who actually had experienced domestic violence. She said, well, I suppose being able to sleep at night, as regards where I'm living, not to feel under any kind of threat. I have to sometimes keep my movements a secret. This is because her ex-partner was still living in the same town as her, in terms of the domestic violence. Safety is being able to trust people. It's surrounding yourself with people you can trust. Okay, so it's very much around thinking about safety in relation to other people. There's a kind of spatial element there she's talking about in terms of sometimes having to hide her movements where she's going, kind of restricted mobility, but also just this kind of ontological sense of security or not being under threat. Someone else, Robert, who has visual impairment, said, for me, I suppose it's about having a routine, I suppose going in areas that I feel safe. you know, and what was interesting from the study, it kind of came up again and again that people with disabilities often organise their lives in a very kind of routinized way, just to, you know, they went to places that they knew that they would be able to access and get around, you know, and that was very key to their sense of comfort or safety in particular spaces. And I think what's interesting as well is how people kind of talk about safety, you know, linking it to ideas of independence as well, but also talk about it in a kind of corporeal sense in terms of the body. So Rose has a mobility impairment, says, well, I can access the street from my house on my own in my own weird independent way, right? I would feel unsafe if I wasn't able to do that, because then I'd be dependent on somebody else to give me a sense of security and safety. So it's about having the kind of autonomy to kind of get around by herself. And it's interesting then how Martin has visual impairment, you know, even just referred to, kind of use the metaphor of clothing to talk about safety as well. So he says, okay, so safety, it's secure, it's like clothing, if you can use that word. You're protected. Being able to walk home from the bus stop for 10 minutes without getting injured, that's what I feel is safe. I'm not even talking about people here. I'm talking about being able to get from A to B in one piece unscathed. So for him, he wasn't talking even so much about the fear of someone coming up to him or being abusive or whatever. It was about the physical environment and you know, how he experienced that environment. But I suppose what's interesting is how then that environment can kind of build into people's emotional understandings of space as well. I think some of the other elements, so some of the elements that I suppose I want to talk about in relation to the findings, and if we look at kind of this idea of assemblage thinking and thinking about bodies in relation to other bodies in particular spaces. And one of the things that came up for people was just this idea of encountering and distinguishing others. So, I mean, we could argue that for many people with disabilities, their lives have been very much shaped by, you know, having to rely on other people, or having to kind of come into contact with other people in terms of getting around. Sometimes it can be just about being in a space. If you have visual impairment, you have to ask someone because, you know, in a way that we wouldn't have to. In the context of the home then, you know, often people living at home might have a kind of personal assistant or someone to help them. So there's kind of those dynamics in terms of thinking about the relationships between others. So some people kind of, in terms of perceiving and encountering others, you know, many people articulated that safety was about being around people. You know, some people described feeling less safe if they were living alone. But also there was a sense that people were constantly trying to negotiate between, you know, what they might perceive as threatening others and those that could be described as trusted. Okay, and this is very much down to, I suppose, people's socialisation, their prior experiences as well. So just in terms of thinking about trusted others, or the kind of strategies that people use. So Molly, who has an ID, she said, I only say hello to people that I know. I don't talk to strangers or nothing. And if we're walking down the street and the bin man might say hello, I don't know the bin man. I know the postman because he arrives into my house for bills. So there's a sense that she'd been socialised to say, well, don't talk to strangers. And another woman who was kind of living by herself in the community, she said, people are actually used to me now, and that's very important when we're integrated into the community. And I make a point of asking people their names or their tills and telling them who I am. I tend to use the same places all the time because of that. So for her, like building up these relationships with people, having people that she knew were trusted, whether it was in kind of shops or, you know, locally, that was very important in terms of, you know, building her sense of kind of safety where she lived. On the other side of it, people kind of talked about encounters which were rather more negative, which kind of, I suppose, you know, very much contributed to kind of senses of unsafety. And, you know, people with visual impairment in particular talked about this experience of ghosting. It's kind of where people just come, they're aware of people coming and standing in front of them, and they have that sense someone's standing in front of them to almost see, are you blind? But they don't speak to them, but they're, you know, which must be incredibly intimidating. So Marion, who has a visual impairment, says, sometimes when you're out, it doesn't happen too often, but you know, you're being followed. And that's kind of creepy. And sometimes curious people will just stand in front of you to see, you know, are you blind? And that can be a bit daunting. Or if someone decides to talk to you all the way around your wall and they're not going away and you're coming near your house and you're saying, oh my God, will I go to my house or somebody else's, you know? And people standing in front of me just kind of poking you and running away. You know, so people are kind of experiencing these types of threatening encounters as well. And Aoife, who has a visual impairment and she's kind of living in the centre of Dublin, you know, just saying, well, I was walking down the road one day, I was going down towards the quays, and I just bought a can of Coke, and I had it in my hand, and then somebody walked past me and went, "Give me that can of Coke, you effing bastard." You know, nothing wrong with that in the sense that nobody hit me, nobody touched me, but I don't think you get that in Dalkey. I haven't experienced that a lot, but perhaps somebody less robust from it than me would find it quite intimidating, because every time you go down the road, there's collections of drug users under the viaduct, and they're always arguing and shouting. And I suppose what's interesting there is how people, almost kind of in terms of distinguishing a threat, kind of sometimes worked around those stereotypes in terms of, you know, the identity, oh, it's the homeless people, it's the drug users, but just in terms of constructing that kind of, you know, or explaining it. But I suppose what's interesting in Aoife's kind of case, that she's kind of saying, you know, I recognise that people more vulnerable than me, or some people with disabilities might react badly to this, but, you know, this obviously is an intimidating incident, but she kind of resists that notion that, oh, I'm vulnerable, you know, it's something I can deal with. I think the other kind of significant part of this, in terms of the study, was around, you know, the relationship between the body and objects and environments, and that's kind of really key in terms of people with disabilities. You know, and I think a lot of the objects or technologies can mediate how people do and feel safety in different places, and how what Julia Belser calls the kind of physical artifacts of disability construct and mediate safety in place. So we could be talking about things like guide dogs or wheelchairs or white canes, but they have a very much contribute to people's understandings of how they feel at a particular time, and many people articulated that they were aware that some of these were almost acted as symbols of vulnerability, not for all people, but they recognise that. So Rose said, well, if you're in a wheelchair, I mean, I just suppose it's self-reliance and self-preservation, because naturally, well, most people with a disability do things differently, and maybe it's a slower pace than anyone else. So you're not going to be able to run 10 times to a mile when somebody comes up, you know. Another participant, Brian, who uses a guide dog, he kind of was interesting the way he kind of articulated this in terms of saying that potentially you felt more confident with a guide dog than you would with a white cane, for example, about being out and about. So he said, well, it's a feedback loop thing, because you have to be a bit more positive to work a dog, because if you're unsure of yourself, you're not going to work a dog properly at all. But the other thing about it is once you've got a dog, you've got much more reason to feel safe and happy and confident, and it also means people come and talk to you all the time. Okay, so there's a sense that having the dog act as almost as, he said, well, they're not guard dogs, but, you know, it kind of gives you kind of rather different sense. I suppose in relation to that, you know, a couple of our participants who are visually impaired spoke about the white cane as being more like, I suppose, an indicator of insecurity or for them or vulnerability. So, you know, one of our participants, Robert, he often comes into the city from his kind of local area, and he spoke about how he said, I don't use it, the white cane, in his local town. I just don't feel comfortable. But I have no other choice when I get to the city because I'm on my own, and I suppose it makes people aware of my situation. But also he was very kind of reluctant to use that because he thought it might mark him out. And Aoife kind of was explaining this. She said, first of all, the white stick it does have a stigma attached to it. You do associate a white stick with a blind person, and perhaps, you know, somebody with a white stick or a long cane that's walking along, you know, you're moving the cane from side to side because that's the technique you use. That is, I'm very much feeling my way in front of me. So you're sort of saying all the time, you're walking, that I'm blind. Okay, but in a sense that you might be a target. And I suppose, you know, in a couple of incidences as well, you know, we saw a very clear way in which the kind of equipment that was part of, you know, the person and the disability was actually actively used against them. Okay, so there's one incident where one of our respondents, Martin, in a previous location where he lived, had experienced kind of antisocial behaviour in his housing estate. And he said, I've had a few issues with antisocial behaviour. That's been pretty bad. I would have had people put their hands in my door, take out my cane, break it and throw it back again. I've had pipes broken at the side of the house. But it's interesting how he constructed this. Breaking canes is kind of past the point of no return. That's personal. You know, it's in a sense, often, you know, a lot of kind of critical disability studies has argued that the equipment, in a way, can sometimes be seen as an extension of the body. You know, it's an extension of that kind of corporal experience. And also the woman that I mentioned before, who had been subject to domestic violence. In that context, some of the equipment that she had for her health condition was very much used against her in the space of the home. So, for example, she had a chronic lung condition that required her to use a dehumidifier in the house, and her ex-partner used to tip the contents of the dehumidifier over her head as a kind of act. So in this case, we're seeing kind of very stark examples of where, you know, these kind of artefacts, if we're going to call it, artefacts of disability are actually being used against people. And what was interesting is people like Martin and also this other participant that were called Jer have actually taken to wearing, what do we call them, webcams, you know, recording devices on the person when they're out and about. And you know, Martin explained how he felt, although he contacted the guards about the incident, he felt they didn't do a lot, but he said, once I put the webcam on and I went out, they said, he said the issue stopped because, you know, he describes this kind of group of teenage kids who were kind of, he felt were kind of perpetrating this activity. He said once they saw the camera, they were like, that's it, you know, because we know we're being recorded. So it's interesting there how people are using equipment in a kind of resistive way to kind of almost protect themselves. Okay, I'm just going to finish the time. I suppose the other thing as well, so we talked about objects, but people talked a lot as well about particular environments and the environments that they kind of felt safe in or not safe in. And these were some of the photos that we took when we were out and about with people kind of on the walkabout. So some people talked about, you know, having to cross roads where there were no crossings. So these are very much the kind of physical things of being in the environment, but they can really lead to a sense of unease or discomfort, which kind of heightens that sensitivity or that concern that you're going to be targeted in some way. So in this, it was about, like, the top picture was about trying to cross the road where it wasn't kind of clear. Other people spoke about, you know, particularly people with visual impairments spoke about trying to avoid broad open spaces because they felt they had no kind of guide around there. They talked about how they can, you know, the sensation of being able to hear walls. They're kind of aware of when they're near a wall, and it helps guide them along. So Eva, for example, said, I steer clear of plazas because to me they're just massive areas with no sense of knowing where I am. And Robert also talked about, you know, when he kind of came up to town saying, well, it's making sure all the audible signals work to let me know when it's safe to cross. Like, there's a lot around the city that don't work. So before I get there, I'm like, God, I hope there's somewhere around that I can ask because it makes me feel really nervous. Okay, so just that sense, that kind of physical or lack of physical access or some part of that assemblage going wrong can, you know, lead people to feel very, you know, insecure or unsafe in a particular context. I suppose the other thing is, I suppose one of the criticisms that's been levied against some of this relational work, which seems to deal very much with the present and like your experience of being in a particular environment at a particular time, is that it doesn't, I suppose, pay enough attention to people's memories and the kind of spatial habits that they develop and the kind of temporal aspect of things. But I mean, this was kind of quite clear in speaking to some of our participants around how their kind of memories of things or their kind of socialisation feed into their current experiences of places. And Marion talks about, you know, how, you know, often she didn't feel safe in her home. She didn't feel that was a particularly safe environment. And this has kind of led to some of the ways or some of her concerns. So she said, Marion has a guide dog. She said, like, this is crazy, but I have a dog running out the back for the dog to relieve himself. Sometimes at night I'm saying, now what's to stop anybody coming in my back door and I'm going on into the dog run? And I'd be going to lock all the doors at night, and I think it's because about 2 years ago I had a workman here and he stole things out of the garage, and I've never been quite the same since. You know, so these kind of memories feed into kind of spatial practices and habits now in terms of how people exist within, in this case, in their home. And similarly, Martin, who I was talking to you about, who had the experience of kind of having his cane broken when he was, again, that was a kind of very much an invasion of his personal space of the home. But he talks about now how he's developed habits when he's out and about based on that experience. So one of the things that used to happen is that people would leave kind of bottles, or he describes them as Pringles containers on his steps. So he had a, you know, he tripped and fell when he was coming out of his house. So he said, it got to a stage that I couldn't get out of the house and go down the 4 steps without scanning the steps twice, he uses a cane, with my cane, because there could be a 2-litre bottle of cola or a Pringles carton. So that level of safety was a heightened alertness that you couldn't go outside your door without scanning. So like, that's just an extra routine. You know, I formerly wouldn't have scanned steps, but now I do kind of religiously. Okay. And I suppose the other thing, you know, when I was talking to Martina, who was the woman who'd experienced domestic violence, and you know, just talking about the kind of the home space, and you know, associating different spaces in the house with you know what happened, and she said it's quite toxic, really. I think, you know, even looking at those chairs over there, I was thinking, well, I was sitting in one of those when he actually broke a brush over my back from behind to the sliding door, and yeah, there were lots of brutal memories, really. So, you know, they're still informing how she experiences living in that house or the home, because she's still living in that space. Okay, so I'm coming to the end, 2 more slides. I suppose one of the things that becomes clear just from talking to people with disabilities is that how they do enact these kind of spatial strategies in negotiating safety and unsafety. So participants did speak about enacting spatial strategies in performing or planning for future safety. You know, so some people spoke about how they when they were buying a house, they bought the house in a particular part of the estate where they felt it was safer or they weren't so isolated. You know, people spoke about, you know, the places they go to shop or to live, and, you know, safety was an aspect of that. You know, and people also awareness of like how places change at different times of day and different times of night. So a lot of people said, well, I wouldn't go out at night to this place. And I mean, one of the quite striking things that has come from speaking to people is how often most people with disabilities said they wouldn't go out after, 6 o'clock. You know, which I kind of think is quite shocking in a way, if we're supposed to be all about inclusion and participation, but they just felt, not everyone, but a lot of the people we've spoken to have kind of made that point that, oh, well, it's fine, but I wouldn't go there after this time, or going to places that they think are going to be deserted in the morning, for example. And like I said earlier, I just think that the kind of key thing that comes across is that how far people are constantly planning this kind of routine and planning and mobility with a purpose. So they wouldn't just go somewhere because they wouldn't particularly feel comfortable in a particular space. They wouldn't particularly just go somewhere to go. So, it's a case of, as Rose describes it, unless I was going from A to B and you knew exactly where I was going, I just wouldn't go. So, often we have this idea about people being, feeling at ease in a particular space. You might go wandering, whatever. A lot of people with disabilities said that's not something I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be going out on a routine, and routine was key to that sense of safety. So, some conclusions from this. One of the reasons I've come to these ideas about relational understandings of disability or relational geographies is I think it does offer an opportunity to look at slightly more nuanced understandings of safety and how people build these different components in terms of, if we think about the assemblage of being, this kind of interaction between the body and other bodies and the environment and objects. And it allows us to explore some of those interlinkages and how these kind of assemblages change or can be disrupted as well. So I think it's helpful in trying to get a more nuanced understanding of safety, embodiment of space. I think it also allows us to kind of challenge some of these ideas about what spaces are safe or unsafe for people with disabilities. And some people, people were very much articulated, they might not describe it in this way, articulated the contingent nature of space. So they were able to say, well, if I go out at this time and do this in this particular way, I'll feel safe. But they were aware that if one part of that assemblage was disrupted, like suddenly there weren't people around in a particular space, that could very much disrupt their kind of perceptions of safety. And other people actively resisted some of these stereotypical perceptions. So Rose, for example, who lived in a kind of big house in a quite rural area, said, well, people are always saying to me, aren't you lonely here, or don't you feel isolated, don't you feel like you're going to be a victim of crime? And she said, I don't know, I just got this inherent sense of I'm comfortable, I feel safe here, so I don't see that as a problem being here by myself. I think also that the kind of value of this approach is that it does allow us to kind of look at the interaction between things like the environment and physical access and things we might consider objects and the emotional, the affectual, so the way in which things around equipment become bound up in people's emotional experiences, or the fact that it's not enough to perhaps just provide access, that's a kind of technical fix, but we have to understand how that feeds into people's affectual, emotional understandings. And I suppose the final point really is just around the importance of listening to subjective experiences of people with disabilities. So even if we're thinking about some of the consequences of this work for agencies or policymakers, that we have to kind of listen to those experiences in terms of what they're saying about safety. So that's it.